Hey everyone, it's great to have you back on the show. Zimbabwean Lives Matter, the social media campaign that captured the southern African country's bubbling frustration and anger over soaring human rights violations, surpassed 1.5 million tweets, likes, and shares when it reached its peak about 3 weeks ago. But what has become of the resistance not only online, but also on the ground? As the struggle of millions of Zimbabweans, also affected by a worsening economic crisis, is no longer making headlines, Beyond the Noise investigates its ins and outs. What are protesters fighting for? How is the government of Emmerson Mnangagwa responding to the movement? What is at stake for the nation if the crisis isn't resolved? Stay put as we answer those burning questions and hear from figures of the anti-government movement on this week's Beyond the Noise. Now, the month of August was marked by the arrest and detention of a plethora of activists and journalists in Zimbabwe. Famous and anonymous citizens alike allegedly came under fire for speaking up against President Mnangagwa, his cabinet, or the ruling ZANU-PF party. As scores of demonstrators have defied protest bans again and again, the president has continuously denied that a crisis is unfolding within Zimbabwean borders, as reported by the AFP. On August 4th, Mnangagwa laid his card on the table. In an address to the nation, the president said that attempts by a few rogue Zimbabweans to destabilize the country in league with foreign detractors would be overcome. Well, guess what? The leader's rhetoric is nothing Zimbabweans haven't heard before. It's actually reminiscent to that of his predecessor, former President Robert Mugabe, who ruled the country for 37 years before being abruptly ousted following a military coup 3 years ago. For instance, in a 2009 speech at the UN, Robert Mugabe denounced his US critics, whom he referred to as, and I quote, detractors and ill-wishers, for reporting mass starvation in his country. In an interview with the Associated Press during his visit to New York, Mugabe also said that people in his country were not hungry, but that they could not afford their favorite food. He added that Zimbabweans are very, very happy. Well, beyond their severity towards dissident voices and their denying of the scope and magnitude of the crisis happening under their rule, Mnangagwa and Mugabe both belong to the same political family. The ZANU-PF, otherwise known as the ruling party of Zimbabwe since its independence in 1980. The political formation is viewed by many pundits as the establishment that has perpetuated bad governance and corruption for decades. And it's not the first time the ruling party is actually faced with persistent waves of protests off and online. In 2016, when Pastor Evan Mawarire launched the This Flag social media campaign, well, it quickly became viral and pushed thousands to voice their anger at the government. If we compare the country's situation then and now, again, the similarities are glaring. The economy had run out of US dollars, unemployment was high, and corruption rife. Today, the equation seems to have worsened, especially as the country was also affected by the COVID-19 crisis. Inflation reached 837.53% in July, the second highest in the world. Now, what next, you may ask? As the standoff between the civil society and the government continues, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa announced that he would send a special envoy to Zimbabwe within days in a second attempt to resolve the crisis. Indeed, 3 veteran South African politicians traveled to Zimbabwe in early August, but those envoys only met with President Mnangagwa. One of the most prominent investigative journalists in the country, Hopewell Chinono, is still in detention after being arrested and charged last month with inciting public violence. Activists, on the other hand, are unequivocal. According to them, Hopewell Chinono was arrested because of his exposing of corruption in the health ministry during the purchase of medical supplies to tackle the coronavirus. The reporter, who has been constantly denied bail, is in poor health, according to his lawyers. This was also corroborated by human rights activist Makomborero Haruziviche, who also shared his perspective on the soaring human rights violations in Zimbabwe. Have a listen.
Instead of taking measures to prevent the coronavirus, taking measures to protect citizens, they are actually using the COVID to clamp down and close down the civilian space. They have been stealing funds meant to buy, medication, to buy protective clothing for COVID, to buy, things to ensure that our health system is equipped to confront this global pandemic. It has worsened in terms of the regime's response to, number one, human rights activists, journalists just doing their work, doing their job. It has also been indicated by the high numbers of people arrested. Like, come on, in just less than 2 years, more people have been charged with treason than in Mugabe's 37 years of misrule. In Mnangagwa's just 2 years of misrule, we have seen people almost 30 arrested and charged with treason.
Now, disinformation seems to have soared in the midst of the current crisis in the country. But this trend is revealing of the country's pulse, according to the paper. In the same article, the author argues that the Zimbabwean rumor mill's preoccupation with stories of coups and backroom deals speaks to an important truth about the country's politics. President Mnangagwa is widely seen to be in trouble. Well, I guess time will tell. On this week's Pass the Mic segment, we spoke to human rights activist and pastor Evan Mawarire about Zimbabwean Lives Matter, how the current anti-government movement is not happening in a vacuum, and his confidence that Zimbabweans will continue to speak truth to power. Thanks for being on the show. How are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm doing all right. It's one of those seasons where once again, you kind of think deeply about your own country and the work that you do. But besides that, thankful to be alive and to be able to tell the story of Zimbabwe.
Well, you became a bit more internationally known when you launched the This Flag movement a few years ago, and that was an anti-Mugabe protest, just denouncing some of the abuse that was happening under his regime, so to speak. 4 years have passed, and a lot of reports that we are seeing emerge from Zimbabwe, things are worse than they used to be. How would you describe the evolution from Mugabe to when he was ousted to what we are seeing now with Emmerson Mnangagwa in power?
Well, I think the painful thing that every Zimbabwean will tell you was that when Robert Mugabe was removed from power, the hope and the expectation that every Zimbabwean had was that this is the chance and opportunity we get to reset Zimbabwe. This is an opportunity we get for us to start afresh, to bring everyone involved. The big march that happened in Zimbabwe in November 2017 did something in Zimbabweans that most of us had never thought possible. It brought everyone from everywhere together to demand one thing, that Robert Mugabe should go. So the expectation was that together we'll be able to move Zimbabwe forward. But unfortunately, immediately after that happened, and of course leading up until to where we are now, Zimbabwe has literally carried on the legacy of Robert Mugabe. This is what Emmerson Mnangagwa has done.
But wasn't that a bit expected when we knew that Emmerson Mnangagwa was part of the establishment? How was the expectation that there was going to be such a stark difference from the old regime to the new one when he was such a traditional figure of politics?
I think if you understand what Zimbabweans had been through for 37 years with Robert Mugabe, you'll understand where our optimism was coming from. It was coming from a place of being tired of being brutalized, of being tired of having the economy implode on you multiple times in one generation. So this was a chance, a once in a generation moment. And so if you understand that hurt, if you understand that trauma, if you understand the brutality that we had been through, you will understand the optimism that people had, that just maybe this may be a moment in which things could go differently. And I think that underpinned that hope that we wore on our sleeves, underpinned the involvement of citizens from every walk of life. It invoked that sense of, I want to be there, whether it was the opposition, whether it was even the international community, the goodwill was just there, given by everyone to say, we desperately need and want a new start. Can we please do this together?
Well, there seems to be a new moment happening, and I'm not sure it's the same or it's comparable to what you saw unfold before. Do you believe that there could be an outcome that would be significant for the country's future? How do you see things unfold? And obviously, that's going to be a little bit of a prediction, but what is your feeling about what's going on right
I think already the people-driven protests or movements that have begun in Zimbabwe, and starting off with the time when we started off in 2016, there were some even that had begun even before we started in 2015 with the young Itai Damara, the journalist who used to stand in the city square with the big banner that said "Failed Mugabe must go," and there were others that came after. We came on. Already, these have borne fruit. In this current dispensation, we have seen people draw attention to Zimbabwe's problems on an international level through these movements. Mm-hmm. And that in itself is a success. Is a success. It is a success because the world has taken notice. The world is asking questions. Envoys are being sent. Questions are being asked. Deeper looks are being taken into what the problems that the citizens are talking about, actually are. And then this is what is important for Zimbabwe. If we are going to see a change in this country, it must not exclude the voice of the ordinary person on the ground. It cannot just be traditional civic society. It cannot just be the international society. It cannot just be the traditional politicians or opposition politicians. The ordinary young person, the ordinary old woman, old man, middle class, working class, those are the people who were disenfranchised and literally dispossessed of their right to protest, their right to speak to power, their right to challenge government by Robert Mugabe. So this is the return, of people to their original position of being active citizens.
Evan, I'm going to have to speak of some accusations that have been directed at you by Jonathan Moyo, who used to be a minister, who has basically been saying that your whole movement, this flag that you started back in 2016, was a pure product and project of ZANU-PF, and that it didn't last because it was Emerson Mnangagwa's project. First, what is your response to that, and how do you usually deal with this kind of accusation that is directed towards you as a dissident voice, as someone with such a powerful megaphone in your country?
Well, I mean, first of all, a conspiracy theory comes up maybe 2 or 3 come up every month about whose project this flag was or is, and who funded it or who's funding it. I find that quite interesting because the moment that Emerson Mnangagwa came to power, we did not stop speaking truth to power. We continued on that trajectory. There was an abduction attempt at my house because of that, and then I was arrested on January 16 and was in prison up until February. In 2019, under Emerson Mnangagwa, I eventually spent the entire year out on bail, under arrest, and going to court. So I don't understand how it is that Emerson Mnangagwa's project, suddenly turns on him. It's important for him and other people to realize that just because people are successful in speaking truth to power and are successful in shaking you as a government doesn't mean that they are always someone's project. Zimbabweans have got the capacity to think for themselves and to act for themselves. And I think that's one thing that has troubled Jonathan Moyo and those that were in power, that people could actually think for themselves and organize themselves. Yeah. I think that the cries coming from Zimbabwe are ones that the world should not regard as white noise, and that beyond the noise, there is a genuine Zimbabweans will continue to fight for their country until it becomes what it's supposed to become. Joshua Nkomo, one of our great heroes and fathers of our nation, said this years ago before he died. He said, Zimbabwe will not die because the young people will save it, and save it we will.
Well, what a beautiful saying. Thank you for sharing with us, and that's a beautiful way to end this conversation. Well, that's it for this week's Beyond the Noise. This episode is a reminder that as stories may leave the headlines, people on the ground are still affected. And that's why on Beyond the Noise, we want to keep shining a light on them whenever we can. Please share your thoughts with us in the comment sections below, and I will see you again next week. Stay safe.